In this video, we cover Chapter 5, Valuation and Market Analysis. There are 8 possible questions on your exam. With that, let's go ahead and get started. I would like to address a few things before we get too much into the material. Valuations, when you're evaluating property, there's really kind of 2 sectors. The first sector is the appraisal sector. When you go in and get a loan, they hire an appraiser. The appraiser goes out and determines value. Sometimes those values between the appraiser and maybe market value whenever you go out and price a property might vary. Okay, that's just part of the system. The first question when an appraiser is evaluating property is pretty much, why am I here? What is this appraisal for? That's the first question that they have. It'll also be pretty much the first thing that if they ask about what's the primary purpose of the appraiser, is to go out there and say, okay, what is the purpose? Why am I here? Because you might be appraising for refinancing, it might be appraising for a second mortgage, or it might be a market appraisal that's involved in the sale of a property. When we evaluate property as licensees, we take essentially the same material, but the appraiser uses a few more complex figures and goes about it slightly different. But pretty much those are almost the same. I mean, we can pretty much guarantee, or not guarantee, we can pretty much establish those values pretty well, and then the appraiser comes in and helps substantiate those values. So this is a large part of what you're going to be doing. This chapter actually has a lot more practical application to what you're going to be doing when you're in the business. Let's go to the first part there, Financial Institution Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act. It's FIRREA, or FIRREA for short, and this basically establishes licensing requirements and standards for appraisers. So just know what FIRREA does. It establishes those criteria and licensing standards. C, appraisals performed as part of a federally related transaction must comply with state standards and must be performed by a state certified or state licensed appraisers. A lender will hire an appraiser. That appraiser must be licensed, or they can't work for the lender. So those state certified or state appraiser are the ones that do the primary or the vast majority of all the appraisals in the state. Go to 2, Roman numeral 2, appraisal and value. A, an appraisal. This is the textbook definition: an opinion of value, a detailed estimate of a property's value by a professional appraiser. Simple as that. B, competitive market analysis. This is the one that we use when we go out and price property. It's called a CMA, or competitive market analysis. You'll hear that term, you'll hear it in this class, and you'll hear it whenever you get out there in the field all the time. Somebody in your office will say, I'm doing a CMA. You'll know what that is, competitive market analysis. It's the best guess based on our data. When you go on board, if you're in an area that has an MLS, that data is licensed. You go into it, you have a right to use that data. It brings up the sales, the pendings, all the actives in the area, and it goes back. You can go back. Many MLSs have archive searches. You can go back for years and years and years, and that helps us determine value. You typically use about 6 months, and if you can't get 6 months of data to help you support a price, then you might want to go back a year. But most CMAs and appraisers, they go back just a certain amount of time, because you don't want to go back 5 years ago, because that's not a good comparable. So that's what a CMA is. And I'll read through this one because it's a good definition. Used by the broker or the salesperson to help the seller determine a listing price for the property. Basically, it's a comparison of recent sold, currently for sale, that are similar in location, style, amenities to the property of the listing seller. So if you go into an area and you have a house that's 10,000 square feet, and you have and the rest of the houses are 5,000 square feet, and the subject property you're listing is 4,500, then you're not going to take the 10,000 square foot house and use that as a good comparable. You're going to take things that kind of look the same and are about the same size. Okay, does that make sense? The next is C, broker's price opinion. This is used when you're dealing with corporations. Remember a couple chapters ago, you're dealing with corporations, they might ask you to do a broker's price opinion. It's pretty much more of a more detailed CMA, similar to the CMA, but different in that it usually is more detailed because it's used by a third-party relocation company or a corporation when they're going to market property. Go to page 56, D, value. D2, characteristics necessary for a property to have value in the real estate market include DUST. It's an acronym. So think about value means it has a use. We buy a house. Why? Well, because we can live in it, we can garden in it, we can utilize that property. When we buy property, when we buy real property, we have equities being built up. So the more you pay off your property, the more equity you build up. So that's also another useful thing to have property. There's tax deduction reasons. So value, for anything to have value, you have to have certain inherent characteristics. First one, A, is that DUST, is that demand. There has to be a demand for it. And all these things you can apply to real property. Does it have utility? Of course. Scarcity. Now, I know we live in a big world, but it is finite. So I know that there's a lot of land, but you really need to look at value defined as scarce. So real property is scarce. D, transferability. Well, do we actually transfer houses? And I'm not talking about when they split it down the middle and go on the road and drive down. I'm talking about the rights of real property are transferable. So when they talk about transferability, it doesn't mean we pick the things up and move them around. It means the rights. Now, what's real property? Remember the first chapter we reviewed, real property is just not a piece of something sitting on ground. What is real property? It's everything up, everything down, the trees, the bushes, everything is real property. So those rights are transferable. E, market value. Now I'm going to splice this sentence. It's a short sentence, but we're going to stop here a couple times. Number one, the most probable price a property will bring in a competitive market. Competitive market means everything is relatively stable economically in an area. If there's a highway going through the back area and there's a lot of eminent domain going on and there's traffic counts are increasing and there's a lot of noise, those are things that are not competitive. Those things kind of skew it a little bit. So think about that. Maybe it's an area in transition where it's having a lot of rent houses. Maybe they aren't taking care of them. Maybe it's in a declining area. So those things you have to have everything kind of equal in an area. And that's what they that's why they refer to it as a competitive market. The next portion of that sentence, allowing for reasonable time to find a knowledgeable purchaser. Okay, if a subject property is in an area and it's taking 5 years to sell, that's totally unreasonable. There's something wrong there. Something is terribly wrong in that area. A reasonable price is determined by market. If you looked in most metropolitan areas, 3 months to 7 or 8 months would probably be normal. Of course, that varies. So don't quote me on that. It could vary in all sorts of areas. But if a house is on the market longer than 6 months, then there might be some kind of a marketing or price adjustment that probably should be made. 1A, the buyer and seller are not under pressure to act. What if a person has some kind of a personal financial issue and they just need to get rid of their property? That's not a good situation. It could be the detriment to the other areas or other properties in the area. So that's what they refer to. A forced sale, bankruptcy, can't make your mortgage payments. Those are all things that distort our normal market. Go to 2, typical goal of an appraiser, although a property may have different values at the same time. So the goal of the appraiser in many cases is if the sales price says $200,000, can the appraiser support that sales price? They go out and find comparables and say, yep, it supports it. And they appraise it at $200,000. Sometimes you get appraisers that come in exactly that amount, sales amount. Sometimes they go over. But pretty much what they're there for is to make sure that it's worth what someone's paying. 3, estimated price compared to market price, which is the actual selling price. Okay, now I'm going to highlight about 5 or 6 of these next enumerated points under Roman numeral 3, principles of valuation. First one, highest and best use. Okay, let me explain that. Maybe there's a residential home that fronts a major expressway. That property can be bulldozed down and put a multi-tenant office complex or apartment complex. What is the highest and best use for that area? Is it the residential, or is it, 10 times that value if it were a commercial property? Well, when we look at highest and best use, that's the highest and best use for an area. It's not all the same everywhere, but the highest and best use is how can we get the most value out of this property. So when you have all those areas, you have that traffic count, it would be better for a Starbucks than it would be, maybe a residential home. So that's highest and best use. Substitution. The value of a property tends to be set by the cost of purchasing an equally desirable and similar property. So if you have a 3-bedroom in this subdivision, it's $100,000. Or you can go half a mile down the road and get the same 3-bedroom that's $90,000. Maybe not quite as nice a neighborhood. That's considered a substitution. It's as simple as that. Don't overthink these things. It's just concepts. Supply and demand. We know what that is. If you've ever had an economics class, you know what supply and demand. You have to have supply and demand. If you go into an area and you're pricing a property and there's 50 houses for sale and 2 sold in the last 6 months, what kind of market is that? It's not a good one. There's something wrong here. If you have 20 solds, 20 actives, that's balance. And those are the kind of things you look for. Conformity. Does everything look alike? When you develop a subdivision, that's why they have certain restrictive covenants to say everything has to look the same. And this wasn't always the case. When they developed subdivisions in the past, you might have this English Tudor sitting next to a colonial, selling next to a Spanish-style home, next to a colonial again. In theory, that's really not the best way to do it. Now, some would argue, well, it's different, it's a variety. Well, when they develop subdivisions, you'll see the trend is towards something that looks similar kind of architecture. H, contribution. You put a pool into your house. How much more can you get out of your house? Depends. Sometimes it's 0. Sometimes it's a little more. I imagine if you lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, it might be more valuable because you can use it year-round. If you live in Minnesota and you have a pool, that's 60 days maybe. I've never lived in Minnesota, but those are the contribution. What if you redo a kitchen or a bathroom? Can you get that money out of it? Typically, yes, you can. So the contribution is if you add something or improve your property, how much does it add to your value? Anticipation is the value can increase or decrease in anticipation of some future benefit or detriment that will affect the property. Apply anything would be an anticipated value. I wouldn't worry too much about that. I would go over to page 57 and K. Balance is achieved when adding improvements to land and structure will increase the property value. Okay, I'm going to go to the board here. I'm going to point out a couple things, and that's L and M in your text. L, let's discuss. Let me explain what this is. This is I call this the magnet theory. Okay, this is my theory. This is not a real theory. I made this up to express a point. So there really is no such thing as a magnet theory. It's Carter-Maxey's magnet theory. But here's what this is. Envision when you go into a property, or rather a subdivision, you have some averages going on, right? You have average dollars per square foot. When you see this little square with a line in it, that means square foot. You have an average condition in most subdivisions. You have an average size. So you have these averages. Anytime you get way off to the either side, serves to either help you or hurt you. Now, I say hurt. What I mean is, when I've explained this, it's not necessarily bad. It just means in terms of dollars per square foot and what you can expect on your anticipated return and the time it takes to sell your house, that gets tossed into the mix. In other words, when you go into a subdivision and you build the biggest house in the neighborhood, have you ever heard that someone say, "Well, never buy the biggest house in the neighborhood because you'll never get, it'll never get rid of it"? That's a misconception. I would say that if you do buy the biggest house in the neighborhood, what you're going to see is that dollars per square foot will be on the lowest end. Because what happens is your smaller square footage amounts, it's called progression, they're getting pulled up. The big guys, it's called regression, they're getting pulled down. So the concepts for the test, you need to know what the difference between progression is. And that is, the smallest house you'll see typically is the highest dollars per square foot in the area. The biggest house, on the other hand, you'll go down a CMA, the data, and you'll see maybe an $80 a square or $79 a square foot, and you'll see this one, it's $95. It's because there's a concept that everything's getting pulled. So if you think the average is one giant magnet, it depends what it's pulling. So the big guys are getting pulled down, the little guys are getting pulled up to an average. All right, make sense? All right. The next is number 4, Roman numeral 4, approaches to value. We're going to kind of segue into commercial property now, just with this one point, approaches to value. A, cost approach. 1, based on the principle of substitution. It could mean the cost of a suitable substitute for a commercial property when you're dealing with, okay, how much rent can I get into this area? I mean, how much rent can I get out of this apartment complex if I buy this apartment complex versus this apartment complex? If I invest in a commercial property, how much anticipated return can I get? So the concept of the cost approach is really dealing with more of a commercial property. We also have on number 3, depreciation generally applies to a wasting asset such as a building. That's also approach to value. We have to look at depreciation. That's why I say we kind of segue into things that if you're in residential you don't deal with a whole lot. There is depreciation, but this really applies to commercial type, income producing type properties. Go to B, market data approach, sales, comparison, or direct sales. On your test, you'll either see comparative market data approach or you'll just see market data approach. That is and then they'll interchange another term that says sales comparison or direct sales. All of those dovetail into what we do when we price property. So the direct cost is when we go through a subdivision, we look at all the costs associated with, or all the market data associated with it, and we look at all the direct sale and we compare those sales. Those are all kind of dovetail within each other, and they all kind of mean the same thing. Go to the next page, number 58. Go halfway through paragraph number 1. Comparable properties used in analysis should be at arm's length or a normal market transaction involving willing buyers, willing sellers, as opposed to a foreclosure sale, an auction, or a sale to a relative. Okay, let's think about that. Comparable properties used in an analysis should be at arm's length. When you have real estate licensees, brokers, appraisers, bankers, everyone involved in the same sale, arm's length says that if the appraiser is buying their own house, can they appraise their property? Probably not a good idea. So that's what they mean by at arm's length. A realtor that buys a property, there's nothing wrong with it. No one says you can't do that. But when you go into these things, you have to make sure that there's full disclosure, that I am the realtor and I'm purchasing your property. So you have to have those upfront disclosures to say that, I'm a realtor and I have certain data and, certain knowledge. So you have to just disclose those things. So it's okay to have these kinds of sales. It's just we want to make sure that everybody knows what's going on. And if you're involved in personal sales, then you need to let everyone know. Number 2, 4 areas of adjustment. This is what an appraiser does. They look at all these different things. They look at the date of sale. You want to make sure, we talked about that earlier, you want to make sure that that's no more than maybe 6 months. Location. You don't want to price a house or price a property that's in this area and say, well, let's go 5 miles down the road, take a left, go 5 more miles down, there's a house that looks just like mine. Can't do that. They say that you should keep within that subdivision when you price property. If you absolutely cannot find anything, you go back further. But the further you get away from your area and the further you go back in time, the less reliable the data becomes. So when you start, comparing properties 5 miles down the road 2 years ago, it's almost worthless. It's almost worthless data. Physical characteristics in terms of the sale. If an appraiser or even a licensee looks at a sale, everything's selling for $200,000, then all of a sudden you see something that's sold for half that, it raises a red flag. You go, what the heck's going on here? What could have happened? Maybe it was a for sale. Maybe it was a foreclosure. It might have been where mom and dad sold their house to their kids. It was free and clear, and they sold it to half price. Well, those are considered not very good comparables. So you need to be aware of those things. We're going to come back to C at a later date. It's actually will be in your material in the back. C is income capitalization approach. You need to know the formula, so on your own time, and we'll address it at a later chapter, you'll need to know C3, which is at the top of page 59. Formula for capitalization rate. Net income divided by capitalization rate equals value. There's also a few sample questions in the back of the chapter. I would recommend that you go over those and know this. It's really not a very complex formula. And just to tell you that there's not going to be a whole lot of mathematical computations on this. There's a few things that I'll help you with at a later time, but there's not a whole lot of math on these exams. There's a decent amount. But if you know a few formulas and some numbers, you'll be okay. Okay, the next section here is one of those, quote, be familiar with. Number 5, steps in the appraisal process. The one you really need to know, A, state the problem. When they appraise a property, they say, why am I here? What is the reason? Is it a refi? Is it a sale? Is it, what am I doing here? Go to 6, neighborhood analysis. B, residential neighborhoods generally pass through 4 stages. So you need to know these. Growth, things are growing. They stabilize over a number of years. Start declining a little bit. And then you'll have some of these revitalization areas. You can see it in some towns where they're either adding on to some of these old houses or they're just tearing them down and replacing them with really big houses. 7, ethics and appraisal. Go to B1. The appraiser should have no present or planned interest in the property being appraised. Okay, that makes sense, right? These are things that the appraiser, this is the arm's length portion. 2, the appraiser should have no personal interest in the property. 3, next page, the appraiser should not improperly disclose the confidential parts of the appraisal report. And then 4, an appraiser's compensation in the assignment may not be contingent on the amount of the value, which makes sense. Appraiser can't say, well, I'll tell you what, if you pay me a lot more money, I'll make sure that this house appraises. That's obviously a no-no. The last one, 8. An appraiser must retain an assignment work file for a period of 5 years. Wouldn't worry about that one too much, but I think it would be good to know that including brokers and different people in our industry, they have a lot of them have, you have to keep your records for 5 years. And many people are digitizing those records also. All right, we're almost done. Other important terms. C, you need to know that. Cap rate, we discussed that earlier. Comparables. Sold properties listed in the appraisal report generally equivalent to the subject property.
The siren was too loud that time.
Okay.
Just start right where you were right there.
How about you want me to start at other important terms?
That's the first thing that came through was that siren.
Yeah, that siren. That's too much.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll take a drink and what we'll do is I'll pull back a little wider. Right here, and I'll push into you. We'll start with the important terms. Okay, and go ahead and go at your own pace.
All right, we're almost done. Other important terms. First one is C, no cap rate. D, comparables, which are sold homes listed in the appraisal report, those comparables that we've discussed. F, replacement cost, and G, reproduction cost. So let me explain what replacement cost is. I use this analogy. You have a 57 Chevy. You bought it at a classic auction. The construction cost at the current price of the property would necessarily be the exact duplicate. Okay? What that means is if you wanted to replace your 57 Chevy, you'd have to go manufacture one that looks just like your 57 Chevy. Or I'm sorry, go back. Correction. The replacement cost would be if you owned a 57 Chevy and you wanted to replace it with a 2010 Tahoe. That's the replacement. On the other hand, the reproduction cost would be what I explained earlier. The reproduction cost would be you go back, you talk to a manufacturer and say, I want my 57 to be reproduced exactly the way it was in its existing condition. That's it on Chapter 5, and that concludes the review on this chapter.